The topic is drawn from chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita. Prabhupada has entitled it Contents of the Gita Summarized. Just a little introduction. This whole chapter, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is given a special name, different than Prabhupada's. Atmanatma Viveka Yoga, or distinguishing soul from the body. And Baladev Vidwasan has appropriately named it distinguishing the soul from the body. And I was asked to speak about Sthita Prajna in the workplace. And that term, Sthita Prajna, is found in chapter 2. And so the plan is to discuss that section, verses 54 through 63. But before I begin that little review, which I guess you've already covered in your reading group, I'd like to summarize to be specific to the request made of me. What does Sthita Prajna mean? And how to apply Sthita Prajna to the workplace. So this is kind of a preview, summary presentation. In this chapter, starting with text 55, Prabhupada has used Sthita Prajna in different ways. His definition is Krishna consciousness, or steady mind, like Sthita D, or steady intelligence, or perfect knowledge. This term Sthita Prajna can mean any of those things. You can look at in your own time in the word for word from that section, and he's modified, adjusted in the word for word of the verses in all those different ways. Going back a little bit, in chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita, I'm sure you know this is just, before beginning the topic, it's just making a definition of what the topic is. In verse 39 of chapter 2, there's a description given by Krishna that as thus far I've described the position of Sankhya, and now I'm going to describe Buddhi Yoga. So Sankhya Yoga has been covered, and Buddhi Yoga is now going to be discussed. So Buddhi then could be said to be quite similar to, if not equivalent to, Sthita Prajna. And Sthita Prajna has its different application, just like the term chitta. Chitta can mean many things. Chitta, one of the meanings is consciousness. And one of the meanings, according to Patanjali, in these Patanjali Yoga Sutras, it can mean any one of the definitions of the subtle body. That means mind, intelligence, and ego. And spiritual intelligence is spiritual buddhi. So Krishna consciousness, this topic, Sthita Prajna, is, in short, it's Krishna consciousness, or spiritual buddhi, or activities of devotion to Krishna that are guided by spiritual intelligence. That spiritual intelligence comes from Krishna. Super Soul gives that spiritual intelligence we find in the 15th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Krishna is the giver of that. Or the 10th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is the giver of that. So, sthita prajna in the workplace requires Krishna consciousness. Just a little sharing, this little anecdotal sharing. A number of years ago, in a kind of a casual, friendly conversation with my Ayurvedic doctor, he was sharing with me what was going on in the other room. He had like 10 scholars that were translating from Sanskrit to Hindi, because he was, Hindi speaking, and then from that to English. The text that his guru gave him, out of all of the students or disciples of his Ayurvedic guru, his teacher had volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes of ancient Ayurvedic texts. And he was requested by his guru, because he was very, very elderly, to take this teaching and make it manifest through his practice, but also in written form that people could access. So he was very happy, very honored, and very diligently going through all these texts. And then he shares something with me that in order to understand these things properly, it's not just an academic affair, but one requires sthita prajna. So I wasn't thinking too clearly, because I immediately interrupted him and said, I'm sorry, but sthita prajna is possible by bhakti. And it was very strong. And not by other methods, not by scholarship or any other method. Sthita prajna is by bhakti, by service to the Supreme, loving service to the Supreme. Without loving service to the Supreme, one isn't going to have sthita prajna, and then sthita prajna is needed to translate all these texts. So somebody's going to do something if they don't have sthita prajna. They have some scholarship and they're taking Sanskrit and putting it into Hindi, etc., etc. So I was so strong, he was taken aback, because we had a nice friendly relation, and I never previously, at least, had spoken so forcefully. It wasn't like harsh, but it was firm. And his body language was, he pulled back, looked at me, and said, okay. Now, I'm telling you that anecdotal story because the application of sthita prajna in the workplace isn't a piece of cake. Krishna consciousness in a world that's in opposition to Krishna consciousness is not an easy thing to achieve. What to speak of Krishna consciousness in the workplace. And therefore, my preamble to what's coming shortly is, without a strong foundation, emphasize strong foundation of Krishna consciousness, other than the workplace, that is, within yourself, within the heart, within your sadhana. Sadhana, one can say, is establishing the foundation, and upon the foundation, one can build something. Supposing the foundation isn't strong, and you try to build something, well, it's going to be flimsy. It's not going to withstand the tests of time and circumstance. The application of sthita prajna in the workplace is your daily sadhana and evolving in the sadhana practices such that your Krishna consciousness becomes awakened and your affinity for the temporary diminishes and eventually subsides altogether. It's elevated, but that's required for executing and maintaining sthita prajna in the workplace. Now, having said all of that, because this is a discussion between Krishna and Arjuna. Now, as you know, the scene is on a battlefield, and probably your workplace and Arjuna's battlefield are not so comparable. You know, in other words, the challenges to sthita prajna that Arjuna had to face and endure are greater than anything you're going to have to face or endure, most likely in your life. So the principles apply to both situations. Now let us go forward, starting with text 54, because as you see, the verses that we're going to cover are 54 through 63. So starting with 54, there's Arjuna asking. There's the Sanskrit sthita pragyasya ka bhasha. Arjuna said, "Oh Krishna, what are the symptoms of one whose consciousness is thus merged in transcendence?" This is expanding on the Buddha Yoga principle. How does he speak? And what is his language? How does he sit? And how does he walk? So there's 5 questions in one verse. And here's a little summary of those questions and the verses that cover the topic. How to recognize him, how does he speak, how does he sit, how does he walk? So it's 4. So starting with the symptoms, how to recognize him. At the top, sthita prajna is, you know, the proper intelligence. One of the definitions of prajna, or translations of prajna, is intelligence, because it's buddhi, so steady intelligence. Sthita prajna. What are the symptoms? How to recognize him? How does he speak? How does he sit and walk? So, symptom is the overarching one of the 5. So how to recognize him? How does he reveal himself? How does he speak? 2 verses. And that means when there's dualities or provoking circumstances, like in the workplace, of course, anywhere, but in the workplace, it tests your Krishna consciousness, your sthita prajna. How does he react to dualities? How does he sit? That is, how does he remain undisturbed when there's causes of disturbance? What is his mentality when senses are withdrawn from sense objects? So if one is fixed in sthita prajna and his mind and senses are withdrawn from sense objects, now how do you work when your senses are withdrawn from sense objects? It means not in the mood of enjoyment. Not the same as pratyahara, it's bhakti, where the senses are not engaged for sense enjoyment. Then when the senses are extended, what are they engaged in? And what's the mentality behind the senses doing sthita prajna work? And then finally, so there's the withdrawing of the senses. How does he sit? How does he walk? That is, how does he engage his senses? So that's comprehensive, but we're not going to go all the way through 67. We're going to go through 61, 62. And within the bottom right corner, within our disciplic succession, starting with the 6 Goswamis. Of course, one can go back before that, but these are personalities who personify, they manifest the embodiment of Sthita Prajna situation. So obviously there's diversity. That's quite natural. And there's principles involved. So let us go through what Prabhupada has to say about this. This is a lecture on multiple verses from second chapter Bhagavad Gita in Los Angeles, from Prabhupada's lecture. Arjuna is asking questions and Krishna is answering. The message of the Bhagavad Gita is for all conditioned souls. If Arjuna had not asked all these questions, we would not have received such a transcendental message. Therefore, it was necessary that Arjuna played the part of an ordinary soul. Now, this is not new to us. It's just putting a context on our topic. And the context is that Arjuna is asking questions for our benefit, and we should take it in that way, that is, draw benefit. How to have sthita prajna in the workplace. What are the symptoms, etc., etc. So here's verse 25 summarized. How is one who is transcendently situated described, whether his lakshana or characteristics? It's important. Definition. What are his characteristics? Answer, no material affection or material desires from mental concoctions. So, sthita prajna in the workplace. Why would you go to work if there wasn't some material desire or some material affection or something like that? Well, that is to say, sthita prajna in the workplace is a work in progress. There's a sadhana to it, but this is not specifically describing the sadhana. This is describing what does it look like? What are the characteristics of one who is transcendentally situated, fully satisfied by fixing consciousness on the self, by realizing this is the key, by realizing their eternal servitorship to the Supreme Lord. What does that mean? What's your constitutional position in the workplace? What's your constitutional position? There's workers, there's the supervisor, there's the work itself, there's achieving something, reaching goals, deadlines, and so forth and so on. But as you practice, this is the sadhana part, not the sadhya part, work on focusing on who you are in the workplace. That is, you're there, you're meant, the soul is meant to be the servant of something. And in the sthita prajna state or Krishna conscious state, it's serving Krishna. And so this will lend itself to the future verses and their topics. Here's something that Prabhupada has written, as you see at the very bottom. It's from a lecture on these verses from New York. And let's see if we can. At the present moment, in our material condition picture, Prabhupada at 26 2nd Avenue, delivering this lecture to Western people, new people. We are speculating and baffled because it is the nature of the mind to create something and again reject it. Sankalpa, vikalpa. The mind will think, yes, let me do this. And then it will decide, oh, better not to do this. That is called sankalpa, vikalpa, deciding and rejecting. This is due to our unsteady condition on the material platform. But when we decide to act according to the supreme consciousness, that means Krishna, there is no such duality. There's only one thought. code. Let me do it because it is sanctioned by the superior consciousness. It is sanctioned by the superior consciousness. That means Krishna and Guru and Vaishnavas, etc. The whole Bhagavad Gita is based on this principle of life. They're very nice. Prabhupada goes on. In India, we watch the boatman. You've heard this example before. Nice one. On the towpath, dragging the boat with a rope. The boat is in the middle of the river, and there's a big log in the middle of the boat. The log is tied with a rope, and that rope is held by the boatman while walking on the riverbank. So many things disturb the boatman. He thinks, when I am a rich man, I shall cover the riverbank with soft pillows so that when I'm on the pillows dragging this boat, I shall have no pain. Our position is like that of a foolish boatman. He does not seem to understand that if he becomes rich, he will not have to pull this boat. We want to be happy in the same way and cover the whole world with cushions and soft pillows and have no pain at all. This is our plan. But the Lord rejects this plan and tells us that our foolish plans should be rejected. Now, this has everything to do with the theme of the chapter and these two verses. These two verses is Sthita Prajna, being one is detached from duality because they're fixed in consciousness of who they are. Very nice. This is verse 55, kind of an overview. The Sthita Prajna person, that's in the upper left corner, means a man who's fixed in intelligence or pure transcendental consciousness. Now there's a corollary factor, essential corollary factor. What's that? Determination to steady. When determination is steady, then one's intelligence can be fixed. Say it negatively. Supposing determination isn't steady, is intelligence going to be fixed? No. That means sometimes, sometimes not. Sometimes, sometimes not. Anishtha bhakti. So to have nishtha, there's many things, but one of the prerequisites is determination. Knowing what the goal is, being fixed in achieving the goal, and having faith in the means to reach the goal. It's called abhyasa, or yoga practice. Bhakti yoga practice requires determination. When that determination connects with our activities in devotion, you see the arrow that's directly to the right. Desires of sense gratification are given up. And as those desires are given up, the mind becomes purified. That means there's no interruption or intermittent service, not service and enjoying. So it's Sthita Prajna. So this is a nice verse, nice section. And there's satisfaction in the self, that is, satisfaction in serving Krishna. So how is it attained? How is it attained? Engage our senses in serving Lord Krishna. Of course, that's the practice stage, and then the purification comes. And that box that's in red to the right, so you see the green and the red, the green is engaging in service, and those other desires arise from mental concoction. Now, why does the mental concoction arise? It's from the soul desiring separate enjoyment, and so the mind becomes agitated and has other desires that disrupt who we really are. A little summary of these two verses. Remember, these are symptoms. How is one to identify a Sthita Prajna person? How are his intelligence and words affected by another's affection, anger, or neutrality? Plus, minus, or neutral. In other words, how does he respond? This is, how does he speak? How does he respond? Of course, speech, prior to speech, there's something, there's a feeling, there's some processing of the mind by something out there that plus, minus, or neutral. And the answer is a sthita, dear Muni, is both fixed in knowledge and aloof from the material world. Now, there's a sadhana to get there, but that's the mature stage. He lives on the transcendental platform, and therefore his mind cannot be materially disturbed. So the topic is Sthita Prajna in the workplace, and you have to do your homework before you can have Sthita Prajna in the workplace. And that is proper sadhana to reach the sadhya stage. But that sadhana is including knowledge, and with knowledge, detachment. So now the detachment is vacillating or unstable if it's not based in bhakti, like this discussion with my Ayurvedic doctor. Without bhakti, it's unstable. Sometimes, sometimes not. Now, even the practice stage is sometimes, sometimes not, because of impurities of the heart. But how are those impurities of the heart going to be removed permanently? And that's power of bhakti. He lives on the transcendental platform, and therefore his mind cannot be materially disturbed. So you remember the chart that the material mind materially agitated, comes from the soul that has forgotten his real identity as Krishna's servant. But when that identity as Krishna's servant is revived by association, by hearing and chanting, by practice of bhakti, by eradication of unwanted things and arti nivritti, then one can become fixed. Here's a section from Canto 6, Chapter 17. This is a discussion between Parvati and King Chitraketu. Canto 6, Chapter 17. Prabhupada writes, purport of course, being put into this material world is like being thrown into a salt mine. You will taste salt wherever you go. Similarly, the material world is full of misery. Even so-called happiness is misery. But in ignorance, we do not understand. Krishna conscious person is unconcerned with happiness and distress. Without Krishna consciousness, you're not going to have that transcendental position of unconcerned with happiness and distress, because you'll have a concern based on conceptions of life, of what happiness is, what distress is. And, it's like the common questions that devotees ask, what do I do about this and that and the other thing? There are practical steps to take to how to deal with this and that and the other thing. But the ultimate solution is Krishna consciousness, which is the Sthita Prajna. So when you get your GPS out, you better know what the destination is if you want to get to the destination. This is the destination, making it very clear. Let's see, there's a later verse, 10 verses later in the same chapter. Prabhupada's purport. As one mistakenly considers a flower garland to be a snake, or experiences happiness and distress in a dream, so in the material world, by lack of careful consideration, we differentiate between happiness and distress, considering one good and another bad. Now, this is normal. I mean, who doesn't think happiness, distress, good and bad. We make distinctions. But Prabhupada is likening such distinctions to be inserting a flower garland to be a snake, or the happiness or distress in a dream to be real. That's our experience. That's the verse. The purport is Prabodhananda Saraswati has written Vishwam Purnam Sukhayate. This world is full of happiness. How is it possible? Yet Krunya Kataksha Vaibhavaptam Tam Goram Eva Stumaha. A devotee accepts the distress of this world as happiness only due to the causeless mercy of Lord Chaitanya. He shows that personal behavior is never distressed, but always happy by chanting Hare Krishna. We should follow in his footsteps and will never feel the distress of this material world of duality. In any condition of life, we can be happy by chanting the holy name of the Lord. Now, is this not a very elevated position that we normally don't function in? And therefore, how are we going to be sthita prajna in the workplace? And the answer is no. But we can do the sadhana process where, with your morning sadhana and everything else that you do that's part of sadhana bhakti, you can purify and lift consciousness to the point of becoming like that. We're moving on to 2 more verses. How does he speak? You see the layout of verse 56 and 57. So let's start at the left side. The stage of the steady mind. Again, always steady in his determination. And we heard already, the mind is not disturbed. And when the mind is not disturbed, is neither carried away by elation and happiness or disturbed by the threefold miseries, but accepts it as the mercy of the Lord. And then such a person becomes, this is when the mind is not disturbed factor, he becomes free from attachment and aversion, fear. That's upcoming verses. But that's the fruit of Sthita Muni. Now that's the phrase instead of Sthita Prajna. It's Sthita Muni, same essential meaning. It says specifically now the mind. Mind becomes steady, not disturbed. And another factor or feature of that consciousness of being fixed in perfect knowledge, that's 57, is they're not engaged in creative speculation. Fixed in perfect knowledge person doesn't engage in speculation, but they accept Lord Krishna as supreme. So there you see at the bottom, fixed in perfect knowledge means you're not affected by these dualities, good and bad or good and evil, neither praising nor despising the circumstances. That's a very mature stage, very mature stage. So that's what we're talking about, 56, 57, 58, 59. How does he sit? That is, how does he not engage his senses? You know, the tortoise. How does he not engage his senses? Of course, then there's how he does engage his senses. What is his mentality when his senses are restrained from their object? The answer, Such a person uses his senses only when required. Such restraint is not difficult for a transcendentalist because he has a higher taste. And so there's the tortoise within the shell. There's the tortoise moving about when his limbs are extended from the shell. In verse 58, we have a similar example of the snake charmer being able to charm a snake by his music. And the snake, the cobra, becomes very attracted by that sound. So here's the texts. He withdraws senses from sense object, that is to say, the material enjoyment aspect. So we're already at the Sthita Prajna, at his stage, or Prajnaya, its stage, fixed intelligence, pure transcendental consciousness, where senses are withdrawn. They're not interested in contacting object of the senses for sense enjoyment. That means the ability to control the senses. So that's how does he sit? How does he sit? Sense control, please. And how is it achieved? By Krishna's service. And how is that enhanced? By following the vidhis and nishedas, the do's and the don'ts. That takes the wet leaves so they can become dry leaves, so they can ignite. And the igniting is Krishna's service. There's 59. Notice we're almost there. Celebrated verse, we all know the verse, Vishaya Vidivartante Nirahasya Dehinam. The embodied soul may be restricted from sense enjoyment, though the taste for sense object remains. This is the becoming. It's not there yet. But by ceasing such engagements, by experiencing a higher taste, it is fixed in consciousness. So that's the higher taste. Param Drishva, the higher taste. There's a nice example of the higher taste. Restaurant. Here's the little summary of text 59. The bottom left illustration shows it's imperfect without devotion to try to restrain the senses, like Vishwamitra Muni, etc., or Shobri Muni, etc. And of course, devotees can, if they slacken in their bhakti, they can also become disturbed. But if one, as one, remains absorbed in devotional service, then that's another taste. That's a spiritual taste that overcomes the material aspect. Now notice in the illustration, there's the cleansing of a floor and the washing of pots, the cooking, taking prasadam, performing arti. And just this morning, listening to Prabhupada describe one who cleans the floor. This was in Hyderabad, teaching of to Sanatana Goswami. Cleansing the floor in the Hyderabad temple is part of deity worship, because deity worship is cleanliness, and the temple is a place where the Lord is worshipped. The person cleaning the floor is engaged in deity worship, as good as the pujari who's performing the arti on the altar, or dressing the deity, bathing the deity. It's part of deity worship. It's part of deity worship. And this gives, if done in the right way, in the right mood, it gives fixed consciousness. Fixed consciousness on, I'm given this privilege, this opportunity to serve the form of the Supreme Lord in this way. And with that, the idea is, how does he sit? That is, how does he withdraw his senses from sense objects in the mood of service to Krishna? Without the mood of service to Krishna, the other kind of restraint of the senses is unstable. But here's a homework assignment for all of us. For 1 week, don't criticize anyone or anything. Now, the mind is not going to be necessarily controlled. So it's not even, some object, inanimate thing, but to speak of people. So don't criticize. That is this position of neutrality in the loving service. Of course, you're in the workplace. There may be a subordinate that you have to correct, not criticize, but correct. So you may have to do that. You may have to correct your child. You're a teacher, you may have to correct a student, but not criticize. And what happens? What about when things are agitating in the workplace? Maybe that happens to you. I don't know anybody that it doesn't happen to. And when that happens, Krishna's mercy. So this is a recommendation for you to consider. Oh, some thought. Now we're almost done. When the senses are engaged, that's restraining the senses. Arjuna has a doubt, or Krishna is expressing that the senses are so strong and impetuous, O Arjuna, that they forcibly carry away the mind even of a man of discrimination. The knowledge alone is not enough for controlling the senses. So how to get the higher taste? Work on controlling the senses, but fix consciousness on Krishna. And fixed consciousness on Krishna is not a voice meditation of no thoughts, but by the active process, like Maharaj Ambarish pictured here, where he's engaged in worship of his deity of Krishna with such absorption that he wasn't attracted by anything material. Shobri Muni, on the other hand, became attracted by fish. As a blazing fire burns everything within a room, Lord Vishnu in the heart of the yogi burns up all impurities. At least that's the potential. This is taken from the purport of text 61 of chapter 2. This is a little cartoon. It's not to illustrate voidism. It's to meditate. Meditation means meditate upon the personality of Godhead. And this is one of our last images. How does he walk? That is, what are his activities specific to the mind and senses and intelligence? So the steady intelligence, senses are restrained, and where the senses are engaged fully in service to Krishna. So this, again, our topic of Sthita Prajna in the workplace. If you're not thinking that you're there to serve Krishna, you're not going to be Sthita Prajna in the workplace. How can you be thinking of serving Krishna in the workplace? Because that's your constitutional position. You're going to be serving someone. So it doesn't mean you ignore your supervisor or the co-workers or anything like that. But when you're doing those things, the one whom you're really serving is the proprietor of everything, the enjoyer of everything, Krishna himself. This is it. This is our final section. How does he walk? That is, when the senses are engaged, what does it look like? On the upper left, that's the living entity, that's us, whether you're in the workplace or at home or wherever you may be. It's the indication that the senses are engaged in Krishna's service, and there's some sensation, a sense of that. That is, Krishna is being pleased because of the mood of pleasing Krishna, according to scripture and other indications. Supposing that's not the case, supposing the senses are engaged in sense gratification. So that's a particular type of worship. It's not what Sthita Prajna does. And then there's this sequence that comes in the upcoming verses. We're not going to go through it. Contemplating sense objects, attachment, lust, anger, feeling not satisfied. So that's the same sequence of list. Let's go to the bottom. The bottom is not falling into the material pool, because that's what these verses are discussing. But that's the consequence of not being engaged in devotional service. The one thing leads to the next thing, leads to the next thing. So that is the Sthita Prajna section. And let's summarize. And then we'll see if there's discussion.
Thank you very much, Guru Maharaj. This class is very
Ramapriya, I'm going to summarize.
Yes.
So let me do that.
Yes.
Thank you. The summary is, in this section of chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita, based upon the questions raised by Arjuna, Krishna is going to expand on Bhuti Yoga, where intelligence or Sthita Prajna is in place, and what is it and what is it not? What are the symptoms or characteristics of one who's in Bhuti Yoga or in Sthita Prajna and living in the world doing practical things? Because one can say, okay, from the Sankhya section before, I'm a spirit soul, now how do I live my life? What does it look like? So whether it's in the workplace or in the home or in school or in social circumstances, moving about, or in the marketplace or wherever one may go, what does it look like? What are the symptoms? And how does one engage one's senses? How does one withdraw one's senses? What are the contemplations in the mind when there's something that agitates from the outside? It's not what you want. It's not what happiness looks like to you in the conditioned state. So this section is giving us a very comprehensive picture, very basic but comprehensive picture in principle of Sthita Prajna in the workplace, or for that matter, Sthita Prajna in any place, where your consciousness is fixed, your intelligence is fixed, your mind is fixed, your senses become fixed. So it's the principle of bhakti. In one sense, Bodhi Yoga and Bhakti Yoga mean the same thing because they are the same thing. It's just a different emphasis on terminology. And Sthita Prajna is similarly like Krishna consciousness or Buddhi Yoga or Bhakti Yoga. And incomplete means you're not there yet, and you may become agitated in the workplace, or you become more absorbed in the duality of the circumstance, etc., etc. So a yogi can be in a worldly position and not be agitated by the worldly position. I'm thinking at the moment, just then, with the position of Raghunath Das Goswami when he was restless and he wanted to join Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and Lord Chaitanya said, don't be restless. Live in the world as if you're attached, but don't be attached. Be internally absorbed. And by that, you'll become qualified to being in my association. So he went back and he demonstrated he knew how to engage in worldly activities without affinity for those worldly activities. That's a very nice example of Sthita Prajna in the workplace. Very elevated personality. It takes a very elevated personality, elevated consciousness to remain in Sthita Prajna in the workplace, to work towards it by following proper deities and nishedas, injunctions and prohibitions, especially your devotional practices every morning. So that's it. That's my little summary. Now, Priya, you can do what you want to do.
Thank you very much, Guru Maharaj, for this class on Sthita Prajna devotee. This is very instructive class, Maharaj, and like you demonstrated everything with the flow diagrams and the nice pictures of snake charmer also. So, yeah, yes, madam. So, Maharaj, one question which was coming to my mind was, as you were telling that, like in the workplace, we are surrounded by provoking situations, and we ourselves are also undergoing this anartha nivritti process. So one question which is in the list is like, what if we fail in that situation? Because generally we have a like trajectory when we are doing when we are undergoing anartha nivritti, but what if we are not able to respond properly? How does Krishna treat that? Yeah.
Your question is, how does Krishna respond when we're not Krishna conscious in the workplace? That's your question?
Yes, Maharaj, yes.
Because we didn't respond properly, which is an indication of our lack of Krishna consciousness. Well, it's like a loving parent and a child. Krishna certainly knows, and being a small child, small children are sometimes and sometimes not. So how does Krishna regard as like a loving parent? The main consideration is not the moment to moment, doing well, not doing so well, etc. The long-term consideration from Krishna's side is that we wish to come to him, and he will help us in the purification department if there's a genuine desire that we wish to come to him, not just become good and get accolades for being good or something like that. But how does Krishna respond is your question. It depends on the bhakti strength that we have gained, and how are we thinking about ourselves in relation to Krishna. So that's my response to your question. The best place to practice is your daily japa, and you're studying or hearing transcendental knowledge. Is Krishna to be pleased? If you want to make your mind steady when studying or chanting, it's the bhakti. Krishna is to be pleased. Easier said than done, but that's our bhakti life. Next.
Thank you very much for that.
Anyone like to raise a question? You know how to raise your hand from this technology system here.
Maharaj, there is one more question which is outside this topic. Is it okay to ask from second chapter?
Well, let's see if there's somebody that wants to ask a question in our topic. And I'll take this outside question. Okay, Ramapriya, take it away, and then I think we're going to be able to end.
Yes, ma'am. Maharaj, Yamuna Mataji has a question. Should I read it out?
Go ahead.
So Mataji has appreciation, being in the workplace as if you are attached, but do not be attached. How does one do this authentically and sincerely?
Yeah, that's a comment, not a question. That's nice. Vamsidari. Okay, go ahead. I'm not sure what the question is. Could you restate the question in different language, because it's not clear to me what's being asked. Well, who's at the center is a very simple litmus test. Is my enjoyment at the center and Krishna is the facilitator of my enjoyment, or is Krishna's enjoyment at the center and I'm seeking indication from him, intelligence from him, etc., how it is that he would like to be pleased. So the bhakti principle is the barometer. Who is at the center? So let's just say that the distinction between material and spiritual. Who is at the center? And spiritual is Krishna is at the center. If there's say respond almost the same way, but if there's a blur, it means Krishna is not at the center. For the most part, we're in a mixed bhakti position. And so sometimes it's going to be more Krishna, sometimes more me, and always it's going to be a mix. That's the strength of bhakti is there's only one position, and that's Krishna is to be pleased. And then in this kind of intelligence, that is how Krishna would be pleased and how to come to that eternal position, Yenamamo Bhyantite, is the intelligence that's guiding our activity. Okay, looks like we've finished the class for today. So thank you for inviting me, and we'll see you again sometime. Hare Krishna.
Thank you very much, very much for your precious time.